Waters, How Mountain Rivers and Monsoons Have Shaped South Asia's History. This book is by Sunil S. Amrit. He will appear in conversation with Ornit Shani, and there'll be a brief introduction by Sanjeev Sanyal. To introduce the guests, Sunil S. Amrit is Professor of History at Harvard University, and he's an award-winning author. Unruly Waters is his latest book. Ornit Shani is the author of How India Became Democratic and Communalism, Caste and Hindu Nationalism, The Violence in Gujarat. Sanjeev Sanyal, who will give the introduction, is an internationally acclaimed economist and best-selling author. He is currently the principal economic advisor to the government of India and is also a well-known environmentalist and urban theorist. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sunil S. Amrit, Ornit Shani, and Sanjeev Sanyal.
Good afternoon, friends. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to introduce Sunil Amrit's Unruly Waters. As was just told, it's a book about how mountains, rivers, and monsoons have shaped Southeast Asia's history. Now, as some of you will already know, this is a topic which is very close to my heart. And the reason for that is very simple. Most histories of the world, but specifically here in this part of the world, is written as if all history is some sort of a political process. So it's all about great men, occasionally women. It's about maybe great political and social processes. But you get the impression that this is a unidimensional view of history. And the fact is that history can be actually thought about in multiple ways. You can think about history as evolution of technology and science. You can think of history in terms of how the geography has changed, how cities have risen and fallen, in terms of how rivers, mountains, and of course climate, like the monsoons, have influenced our history. And this is this is of course true of most countries in the world to some extent. But India has a very specific kind of climate and geography. Unlike many other parts of the world, we have a very well-defined climatic cycle, the monsoons, which have, of course, had huge impact on our history. So if you go back through our entire history, whether you're talking about ancient and medieval period trade with the rest of the world, or in fact, even the colonization of India, it's simply not possible to think about it without thinking about the monsoonic winds that blew both our own ships to far lands, but also brought the European colonizers to our shores. Similarly, it's not possible to think about, for example, our very first civilization, the Harappan civilization, which of course popped up like many of the ancient Bronze Age civilizations along the courses of two major rivers, the Saraswati and the Indus. And of course, the drying of the Saraswati and the change in climate had cataclysmic impact on our first urban civilization. And guess where many of the migrants from that collapsing civilization moved on? Many of them moved on to another series of rivers, the Yamuna and the Ganga, and helped trigger what we now know as Indian civilization. So the point I'm making is that geography is one of the very important ingredients into understanding any country's history. And so here we have a book, Sunil Amrit's Unruly Waters, where he takes on, I think, from the late 18th century through the 19th into the 20th century history, and looks at how geographical and natural processes have been a very important ingredient into how our history has evolved. And I think this is a very important lens from which to understand ourselves, especially since we may be living in a period of rapid climate change where much of this geography may change in multiple ways. We are living in a time of urbanization as well, where another way in which our geography is changing. So with that, without further ado, let me request the organizers to bring up the book so that we can unveil it right up here. Sunil, over to you. With that, ladies and gentlemen, let me pass it on to Anil, who is going to be in conversation with Sunil. Thank you very much.
So, good afternoon, everyone. In his really riveting and beautifully written Unruly Waters, Sunil Amrit produces a grand historical narrative of the way monsoons and mountain rivers, as well as the search for water and the human pursuit of the conquest of water, shaped Asia, especially in its two largest countries, India and China, that together account for more than a third of the world's population. Sunil delves into an historical exploration of three dimensions of water that shaped Asia: the monsoons, the great rivers springing from the Himalayas, and the subterranean water, and ultimately the relation to climate and climate change. These unruly waters, Sunil demonstrates throughout the book, are unbounded by political borders. Water is mightier than the lines drawn on our political maps. Into this comprehensive history of water, Sunil weaves a granular, detailed history of the evolution of the science of meteorology, hydraulic engineering, and the study of storms, and of the people, scientists, who drove the desire to harness water in different historical and political circumstances, from the time of the Mughals to our time, with an emphasis on the 19th and 20th century. For example, the historical moment of the recognition of the importance of the Himalayas for water as a resource. He examines the effects of these efforts to harness or to mine water wrought over time on water and on humans. Sunil draws our attention and you know, looking at the effects of these efforts on water and on human, and in doing so, Sunil brings a new perspective on, for example, India's economic transformations in the 19th century. In the mid-20th century, the map of Asia was redrawn. Sunil draws our attention to the environmental consequences of these political transformations. Partition, for example, also entailed the partition of nature, and how that had continued to affect people's life through the post-colonial age. In the face of, in Sunil's words, the stormy horizons of Asia's water crisis, Sunil Amrit brings us a very important history of a critical subject that historians, and not just historians, also novelists and filmmakers, have largely abandoned over the last decades, precisely when looking at it has become more acute. So firstly, thank you very much, Sunil, for writing this important book. Now, as I just mentioned, as I said, you have taken on a very ambitious project in Unruly Waters. And the first thing I want to know is what drove you? What was your motivation in writing this book? How this project was born? And what did you want to change in the way we think about water?
Thank you so much, Ornit, for that really generous introduction to the book. I had spent a long time before I started writing this book thinking about a subject that's very close to my heart, which is migration. And I'd spent a lot of time studying the migration of people from India to Southeast Asia. And as I spent a lot of time in smaller coastal cities, especially in Tamil Nadu, I just came to an awareness of how pressing and how important and how complex crises of water have come to be. And I found myself in coastal places hearing stories of rising sea levels, of recent intensive cyclones that these communities were still recovering from. as I traveled inland, I was hearing stories of prolonged drought. And eventually, the multifaceted history of water came to compel my attention in a way that I didn't expect. I mean, this was not a book I thought I would write, and I was really led both by a historian's curiosity in terms of, how might we think of the 19th and 20th century through the lens of water? And I was motivated by my own concern as a citizen with climate change, with water crises, with all of these issues, and a sense that perhaps a historical perspective might be helpful.
Okay, so it was this experience, and just can you tell us what is it that you wanted to change in our way of thinking of water? Because obviously there was something there in this history of doing it. So
I think putting it at the center of the story was what I was trying to do. Not to tell a different history, but to complicate the histories we already know. So my point is not that thinking about water is more important than political or cultural history, which has been so dominant in how we've thought about South Asia. It is that, in fact, it might enhance our understanding of economic development, of political thought, of all of the things that we are and continue to be concerned with, because it's a vital material underpinning for so many dreams of freedom in modern India. I mean, I think that was the one lesson that I came away with, that water is at the heart of this, and that Indian leaders, engineers, thinkers, and not to mention farmers and fishers, know this very, very well. This is not new, and yet somehow it had fallen away from the ways in which we were thinking about history, I think.
And I have to say that when I read the book, I actually found that point, that putting water as a lens through which to look through the historical ages, exactly, especially from, in detail from the 19th century, was one of the most original things, because you do speak throughout the book about the political circumstances, but water is at the heart of the story, and it does give us a new perspective on history. And one of the things that you suggest in the book is that it was in the 19th century was the time when the scale and interconnectedness of Asia's water became visible with the pressures to put water at work. And the one thing I want you to tell the audience a bit more about is what was the motivation of the Raj in suddenly taking on water to put it at work for flood prevention, irrigation. We know this coincides with a period, late 19th century, of famines, death of millions of people. What was the Raj's motivation?
I think there were very different competing motivations at work. And we think about the Raj, of course, but the group of people interested in water, I think, went beyond the Raj. The motivations of a botanist, a naturalist, a scientist were not necessarily the same as a revenue officer. I think basic self-interest is clearly one of the major driving forces of British interventions in India's waters in the 19th century. They wanted to increase tax revenues, they wanted to increase agricultural production. They worried about the social and political consequences of famines that followed droughts. Because the British were very reluctant not to expand famine relief, in fact, water engineering appeared as a sort of technical, scientific way to solve the problem of famine, which would not require redistribution of resources, which would not require a major expansion of state capacity. In some sense, it was the sort of magic bullet or a quick fix to what was, of course, a very deep social and economic problem, the problem of famine. But at the same time, I think some of this was driven by curiosity. You have amateurs, really the early meteorologists, for example, were not trained in meteorology. They were trained in many of them were military engineers, some of them were private enthusiasts. And then the sort of third constituency I think we shouldn't ignore, even from the 19th century, is Indian nationalists, Indian thinkers, Indian academics, Indian economists, all of whom started to see that water might be central to their future.
And taking it on from that point, Sunil's book, is full of a host of interesting characters through whom we we learn about the history of water and the efforts to conquer water. And as you mentioned, meteorologists, engineers, and some, as you mentioned, were not even educated and qualified as such, but found themselves ultimately as managing huge water projects. And some of these were really appealing to me. But what I want to ask you is, please tell us about one of these characters that really marked their impression on you, and tell us a bit more about her or him.
Let me tell you about one character that stayed with me. A woman called Isis Pogson, who in the 1880s was director of meteorology for Madras Presidency. She really oversaw the entire rain monitoring apparatus of what was then a vast part of India. Her meteorological region stretched from what is now Odisha all the way to the southwestern coast of India. First of all, very unusual to have a woman in such a position of scientific authority in late colonial India. I've seen very few examples of that. Second of all, she was an amateur. She was trained, her father was an astronomer, and she was trained on the job, so to speak, and eventually sort of took control of this whole meteorological region of India. But I'm also interested in her because we know so little about her. She's left many reports as an administrator, but very few traces about her own life. We don't have her letters, we don't have any sense of what it would have been like to be a woman high up in the British scientific apparatus in India in the late 19th century. I do know that she was nominated for membership of the Royal Astronomical Society in the 1880s and turned down specifically on the grounds that women were not suitable for membership.
Amazing that you were able to trace something, because I have to say also on the basis of my own work, the difficulty of finding women in the archives and finding some details about them. And let me move us into the 20th century, and India at independence under the very difficult conditions of a food crisis, water. What stands in your view? What stands in your view as one of the positive achievements of water management in India in the first years after independence?
I think we have to bear in mind what the newly independent government of India inherited. Apart from the crisis of partition, life expectancy in India in the first census taken in 1951, the first census after independence, was just over 30 years. Infant mortality was extremely high. I think the biggest achievement of that early generation was addressing some of these crises to the best of their ability. And we can look back and see that things could have been done differently. We can look back and see that perhaps the emphasis on large dams had some unintended and unwanted consequences. But given the range of choices open at that time, I think one has to be astonished at the ambition with which the Indian government in the 1950s went about trying to address some of these problems.
So Nehru's temples of modernity, these dams, is not something we should be simply dismissive of or just see the negative consequences of.
I think we can do both. I think we can recognize the negative consequences that would in time accrue. Above all, perhaps the displacement of millions of people from their homes, the environmental consequences of the dams. But we also need to remember how appealing they were, not just to politicians, not just to engineers. Think about Hindi cinema in the 1950s. Think about the opening scene of Mother India. Think about the fact that Hindi cinema was consumed around the Third World, in Africa, in the Middle East. These were dreams of a better future. That's what these dams symbolized. And in some ways, it is a tragedy that those promises were not, and in many ways have still not been fulfilled.
So, one of the issues you highlight in the book and brings us to present day as well is the question of inequality. Inequality in the distribution and access to water. And this is not particular to India. We have such problems everywhere. But in India, this has a particular dimension, namely caste. And what is, in your view, the consequence of caste for inequality in relation to water?
I think water is both, in some sense, a measure of inequality, a symptom of inequality, and a driver of inequality in India. It is both of those things. It's a measure of inequality in that access to water is a very clear indicator of social fractures and fault lines in India, social inequalities, caste above all. And I mean, there's one moment in the book where I talk about in 1927, Dr. Ambedkar led a march to a tank in the town of Mahad near Pune. And his demand was that Dalits are given access to drinking water. And this was a profoundly symbolic thing because water was, of course, so important to our existence. And yet, communities of people were being denied access to that most vital of substances. And so this became a major political campaign. And yet we see in a recent report on caste inequality in rural India, edited by Gyansham Shah and others, that in fact one of the ways in which caste inequality continues to manifest itself in rural India is in terms of access to water. So this is an enduring problem. But I think water also drives inequality in some ways, in the sense especially when it comes to groundwater. If you think about groundwater and its essential role in Indian agriculture, only those with the capital to drill deeper and deeper underground are able to access that water. So that in itself perpetuates inequality.
And you know, I can't remember the exact numbers, perhaps you say them, but that was for me quite a surprising fact to realize that is it still 60% of the water that is used for agriculture is from groundwater, from tube wells, etc., and not rainfall. So that puts even in a much more stark perspective what you were just telling us about inequality and the effects on inequality and the dimension of caste. Now, you know, your book ultimately sounds an alarm on the state of water for India and the subcontinent. So you ultimately end the book with some good news, but ultimately it's a sound of an alarm. And you also make the point throughout the book that water does not respect national borders. So could you briefly tell us what you see as the biggest problem related to water, but I would also like to ask you how in an ideal world, if we have to imagine for a second an ideal world, would good water management at the regional level work? So what is the biggest problem, and how, if we have an ideal world, how good water management would work?
The biggest problem, I think, is distribution, in that it is a problem of both scarcity and excess. The biggest problem is how do you manage urban flooding on the one hand and prolonged water shortages on the other, and how do you do that in a context of A, climate change, B, regional influences on the monsoon system, and C, critically depleted groundwater resources, particularly in northwestern India and also in the southeast. In terms of water management, I think we've historically we've juxtaposed local solutions with top-down centralized solutions. And you know, it's a simple thing to say, but I don't think there is a necessary choice between one or the other. I think what we need is certainly, as environmentalists advocate and have advocated in India for 30 or 40 years, we need to learn from local systems of water management, sustainable local knowledge about the hydraulic cycle and about particular landscapes, but we also need cross-border management of water. I mean, I think one of the big crises is, as you pointed out just now, Ornit, water doesn't respect borders, and yet policy is absolutely constrained by borders. And this is true of the Himalayan rivers, perhaps above all, but it's also true of underground aquifers. And I think, you know, perhaps two principles should be at the heart of water policy. One is subsidiarity. You know, if these problems can be solved at a local level, then we should do so until there are those problems which can't, and those need to be coordinated at larger and larger scales. The other major value, I think, that perhaps my book shows we should take seriously is precaution. I mean, I think one of the paradoxes, the ironies of this book is that a number of the ways in which we've tried to solve water problems in the past have led to new and escalating risks.
Now, before we open it for questions on this very important subject, will you please read for us a passage from the book, but please, before you read it, please tell us why you chose this specific passage. Just to say, I just really wanted you to get a flavor of the really beautiful prose of the book.
Thank you, Anit. I chose this book, it's the last passage before the epilogue, it's the last passage of the last chapter, because this is where I was really thinking to myself, what do I want readers to go away with? And since I'm not a novelist, I don't have to worry about spoilers. So let me read from the very last part of the book. At a time of environmental crisis, local histories and national responses are insufficient on their own. It is now easy to see on a map or in an alarming graphic the scale of water-related risks that Asia faces. It is clear that those risks pay no heed to borders. The promise of a new sort of environmental history, a more connected and expansive history of Asia's unruly waters, is to fill that space with cultural and political meaning, to show that the landscape of Asia's mountain rivers and its monsoons have also constituted a space of migration, a zone of trade, a path of pilgrimage. Throughout history, water has both connected and divided Asia. The rivers and oceans have been thoroughfares of trade, as well as zones of imperial domination. In the 19th century, when European empires dominated the world, Asia's hydrology underpinned many of the commodities that fueled global industrial capitalism. The storms that have always menaced coastal regions always crossed frontiers, but states have responded to them in different ways. As connections across Asia frayed in the mid-20th century decades of nationalism and war, water too came under ever tighter territorial control. One reason why almost all of Asia's new nation-states tried so boldly to harness water was to gain self-sufficiency in a post-colonial era in which their autonomy was called into question by the machinations of the superpowers in the Cold War. They were spurred to do so by memories of water's lack, bitter memories of famine and suffering within living memory. If there is one consistent lesson in Unruly Waters, it is that water management never has been and never can be a purely technical or scientific question. Neither can it be addressed on a purely national scale. Ideas about the distribution and management of water are deeply inflected with cultural values, with notions of justice, with ideas and fears about nature and climate.
Thank you. So, please, you're welcome to ask questions. Please, you there, the woman, the lady over there. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Akanksha, and I just heard all of the conversation that we had. My question is, your book was all about the history that we have. The water, the rivers and the mountains, those are affecting how the Southern Asia, right? So if we talk about the future, right, how do you think, I want your point of view, how do you think the countries that we have in Asia, India, China and other countries, do you think that these countries will get together due to water or they'll fall apart? You got my question, right? Thank you.
I think that's in some ways the most urgent and important question on all of our minds, and I think it could go either way. It's quite common in the media to read alarming stories about water wars coming in the next century. There are just as many examples of the fact that water is, in a sense, such a vital resource for all of these countries that it might be the one thing that leads to new cooperative solutions. And I think there's evidence of both of those things going on at the same time. If you think about India-Pakistan relations in the 20th century, after 1947, while the Indus Treaty is not flawless, it has been controversial, it has been, both sides have accused the other of not respecting its terms, it has, given the level of conflict between those two states, by and large worked. it has worked for most of the time since its signing in 1960. And of course, there are calls for revising it, for thinking about it again, but there is a sense in which, in that case, as in other regions of the world, water has been one thing which has allowed states that may have border disputes or that may have other disputes with one another to find at least provisional cooperative solutions. You find this in the Mekong as well. The Mekong Commission, while again has been criticized in many ways, does provide a forum for that sort of discussion and dialogue.
Please, sir, at the front here.
Thank you. Very well done. It's a fascinating subject, and I look forward to reading it. I was just intrigued that you started out this work having first looked into migration. And I'd like to hear, for instance, how did calamities associated with water, drought, famine, for instance, let's say in the southern part of India, how was that a spark for migration? I think of historical processes under colonial policy like indenture, for instance. How did all of those crises around water spark that form of migration? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I mean, you've put your finger on what led me to this, eventually to this book, which was thinking about the relationship between nature and migration. I mean, there's a long established connection between the two. And, you know, many British officials, for example, believed that nature was quite simply the cause of migration, that when there was drought, there was migration. The reality is more complicated than that. I think what we need to do is to think of environmental factors as among many complex factors that lead people to leave their homes. So when drought hits South India in the late 19th century, for example, you see a major increase in migration to some places, but not others. And so what happens is really that sort of pressure of a climatic event comes together with migrant recruitment networks, with social networks, with access to capital that helps to explain when migration is and when migration is not a viable response to climatic challenges. And you know, a lot of recent discussion about climate change and migration points out something which I think is very important to emphasize, which is that being unable to migrate is as much of a risk in the context of climate change as mass migration might end up being.
On this side, this lady over there, please.
Hello, I'm Ruchi Sharma. First of all, thank you for this awe-inspiring and very critical conversation. We've heard a lot of times that the Third World War is going to be on war, on the basis of water, right? So what's your take on it and why? We would like to know.
I think we do hear a lot about maybe not just water, but water and other resources being likely causes of a next major global conflict. And I think all of us are worried when we look around at the kinds of competitive behavior that you see between states in search of water resources, in search of course, mineral resources, in search of still oil, that this has been a cause of conflict in the past, and it certainly, I would not be surprised if it continues to create conflicts in the future. But in a sense, as I was trying to suggest in response to the earlier question, there's also a slightly more hopeful story to be told when it comes to water, which is that, you know, hostile states have, at various points in the 20th century, found ways to manage water collectively because it's so vital to their existence and their well-being.
Sorry, please, sir, yeah. Sorry, no, first, yeah. And then you come next, thanks.
Hi, this is Shubhadeep. Historically, we have taken decisions on water, which, like say, damming of rivers, which we later find was not such a good idea. Now, what is going around India now a lot is the story of linking of the rivers. Now, you've studied the Indian river system, as you say. What's your opinion? Is linking of the rivers a good idea, or is it something which, say, our children's children will say these guys were mad, they linked the rivers and, created a lot of problems?
My hunch is that our children's children will see it as a mistake. I think that at the very least, we need to be very cautious of all the warnings that are being issued by scientists, by environmentalists about the potential consequences of this. The other thing I'd say is that very project itself has its roots in the 19th century. I mean, it's very interesting that the architects of the river linking plan quite explicitly name Arthur Cotton, who's one of the characters in my book, who's a 19th century British hydraulic engineer, as their inspiration. I mean, he believed in the 1880s that one day the Ganga would be linked to the southern tip of the peninsula through a series of canals. So I think there's also a sense in which that sort of inherited history of hydraulic engineering continues to shape our approaches in the present.
Okay, so last final question that I promised very quickly. We're running out of time, please.
Good afternoon, Sunil. My question is in Indian context. We have this tradition that we consider our rivers very sacred, be it Yamuna, be it Ganga. I just want to ask you what went wrong in the timeline that we are now unable to manage it. I mean, they are not proper, they are not flowing in proper manner, they are dirty, and we are unable to, in spite of, cleaning Ganga was one of the motto of Narendra Modi when he was running for Prime Minister, and there is a separate ministry for that, but still, we are unable to materialize our aspirations. So what is your take on that?
Thank you. One of my colleagues, Diana Eck, who's a scholar of Hinduism, wrote a wonderful book called India, A Sacred Geography, in which she really grapples with just that question. How is the Ganga the most revered and sacred river, and also perhaps the most polluted river in the world? And I think we need to think about the fact that it can be both of those things, that it has not become less sacred to people as a result of its extreme degradation. And I think that's when you get the competing meanings and imperatives of water coming into conflict with one another. That on the one hand, you have this raft of demands on the waters of the Ganga that come from people's bare survival, but also from industries and all of the rapid urban development that you see along that corridor, at the same time that much older meanings of this water continue to coexist. The larger question is whether the sacredness of the Ganga and other rivers can be mobilized to enhance environmental consciousness. I'm not sure that's happened yet, but there are some who are hopeful that perhaps tapping into how much these water bodies mean to people might be one way to spur action.
So, firstly, thank you so much, Sunil, for writing this important book, and thank you, everyone, for coming to the session to hear about it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ornit, and thank you all very much.
Congratulations to Sunil S. Amrit for the launch of this book, Unruly Waters, How Mountain Rivers and Monsoons Have Shaped South Asia's History. Our thanks also to Ornit Shani and to Sanjeev Sanyal for the introduction. The book is available at the Full Circle Bookshop, and Sunil will be signing at the author signing area here at the back of the Nexa front lawn. So if you'd like to pick up a copy and have it signed, he'll be happy to greet you there. The next session going on here in 10 minutes is Gene Machine and the Culture of Science, featuring Sir Venki Ramakrishnan with an introduction by Priyamvada Natarajan. That session will be presented by DNA and will start in 10 minutes' time.